Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Sommelier series. I'm here today with a very special guest and a very special topic. Our guest today is Niklas Sundberg, who is the CIO at ASSA ABLOY, one of the world's well-known and leading companies in its space, and also a Nagarro partner. And that's pretty incredible by itself. But the reason we're here today with Niklas is to talk about sustainable IT because he has just written this fantastic book, Sustainable IT Playbook for Technology Leaders, which you can see on the screen behind him. So anyway, I'll talk more about that. But welcome, Niklas, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Manas. Fantastic to be here this morning. So looking forward to conversation.
So, we have this incredibly well-researched, and it's really a playbook. It's got a series of step-by-step instructions and guidances for how to sort of implement sustainable IT in an organization and in the ecosystem. And we are really looking forward to the audience participation. If you ask a question, a related question, legitimate question related to the topic today, for each question, we will be planting a tree somewhere in the world. Yeah, so that should engage you. This is a way also to have more participation from each one of you. So, Niklas, this book is a huge effort. I just went through it over the weekend. It's enormous. It's all the catalogs of references and data and models and interviews that you have conducted with various people. This is a huge effort. I mean, what drove you to make this huge effort?
Well, I think first of all, I've always had a great interest in ESG questions but also seeing as a technology leader what you do as use your platform as a business of change. I also realized that there wasn't really that much on the CIO agenda in terms of how do you get started, where do you need to get started, where are your key action areas. And as I was doing my own research, when we were doing our own sustainable IT strategy, I realized there was very limited research. And speaking to my peers, similar discussions were taking place that they were also having conversations with their chief sustainability officers, sustainability managers in terms of how do you get started? Can you leverage sustainable IT? How can you leverage sustainability by IT? And I felt that a lot of people were struggling to really get started. And that's what I set out to do, really, on my mission to create a vehicle for people to get started. And like you said, it's a playbook because everybody's going to be different. It's going to be different industries. It's going to be different action areas and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that everybody who is connected with the IT industry or in some way or form should go out and buy a copy because I think it's very comprehensive and very actionable. And that's the beauty of the book. And I think that even at Nagarro, we need to hand out copies to as many people as possible. Just one of the points that you made early on in the book is that the IT industry emits about as much carbon dioxide as the aviation industry,
yes,
which came as a complete shock. A few words on that, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. I think it came as a complete shock to me as well when I read that, and then I had to go back, double check, triple check, and see if is this really true. But yes, it is, unfortunately, because in the world today, the aviation industry, like you said, it's 1% to 2% of the total emissions that we see worldwide. But then when it comes to data center, because they are very energy intense in terms of heating, in terms of cooling, in terms of electricity, so that is also on par with 1% to 2% of emission, because such a big chunk of electricity or energy that we use today is not carbon free. It's not low carbon, coming from low carbon sources. So 1 kilowatt hour on the average in the world is 475 grams per kilowatt hour that we consume in a data center. And it's also maybe not, what we see today in terms of 1 to 2% doesn't maybe not seem that much. But if we look ahead in the world in 2025, we had roughly 25,000 terawatt hours of electricity generated in the world. But looking ahead to 2030, we see that the expected case is that we're going to have roughly 40,000 terawatt hours of energy consumption in the world. And that's an expected case. The ICT sector, which the data center is a subset of, it is a 3 to 4% on total today. But looking ahead, out of the 40,000 terawatt hours in 2030, this will be roughly 8,000. So roughly 20%. And that really scares me, that we are sort of being lured into this fallacy that technology, electrification, digitalization will solve everything for us and it will be a great enabler for climate change. But if we don't build sustainable digital infrastructure, we're going to create an even bigger problem for us going forward. So I think that's the great opportunity here as well, that we have the knowledge and we have the facts on the table and we can change it today. We have 8 years to do it. So that's really what I want to get out as a message, that we should make sure that we don't dig a deeper hole that we could get ourselves into.
Yeah, and as you wrote in the book, it's partly coming from the energy that we're consuming and
Yes.
partly from the carbon dioxide involved in the making of these devices, right? Which is a big chunk as well, right?
Yeah. Yes. So definitely today, I think in 2021, we roughly consumed 57 million ton of electronic waste. This makes this the biggest waste stream in the world. And that's also a very scary figure. And just to put this into perspective, 57 million tons is the same weight or a bit bigger actually than the Great Chinese Wall in terms of weight. Or if you load 126,000 jumbo jets with electronic waste. So it's a massive waste stream. And then also, if we just look ahead in terms of 2025, the expectation is that we're going to have roughly around 55, 60 billion devices out there. So obviously, we are consuming a lot of scarce resources like lithium, gold, silver to make these products. But we are not being circular enough to be able to make this a regenerative process. And at the moment, we are consuming 1.8 of the world's resources. So by August of this year, we had already collectively in the world consumed all of the world's resources in the way that nature can regenerate the resources on the planet, so to say. Where I live in Sweden, it's a lot worse, for example. Then we're looking at that we collectively in Sweden, we have consumed the resource by April. So in Sweden, we are consuming 3 planets instead of 1. So I think that's also extremely important to be mindful of, that 8 to 9% today is only circular economy. 92% is a linear economy. So we make it, we produce it, we use it, and then we dispose it. We don't bring it back into the manufacturing or the sourcing process in a consistent way, unfortunately.
So just for those who are joining us late, we're speaking with Niklas Sundberg, who is CIO at ASSA ABLOY, on the topic of his new book, Sustainable IT Playbook for Technology Leaders. And you're encouraged to ask questions. In every legitimate question will have a tree planted for it. So if you want to plant some trees, then you can ask some questions. A couple of the references that you made, Niklas, may not be completely apparent to everyone. When you said that we have 8 years, the Paris Agreement has this goal to keep the rise in temperatures down to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, which is itself scary. We are sort of saying, okay, 1.5 degrees Celsius is okay. Yeah. But what we need to achieve for that by 2030 is that each individual should not be emitting more than 2 tons of carbon dioxide in a year.
Yeah.
And if you just mentioned the 1 kilowatt hour is like a few hundred grams. It adds up pretty quickly, right? And and you also mentioned, for example, that one single long haul flight could maybe consume 8 months of your budget. And I love the way of looking at it, because I think that the awareness isn't there, right? So if I turn the air conditioner on, just what is the impact of that, right? In terms of my budget for carbon emissions. And I think that some of the examples that you give start to move us in the direction of thinking about it in that sense, right?
Yeah.
So, you said that Sweden was pretty bad in some of these factors, but
yeah.
We always think of Sweden as a very ecological country, some comments on that, some thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that there are also very positive aspects in Sweden. I think I mentioned the 475 grams in terms of the global average for CO2 emissions. I think in Sweden we have a very good way where we have almost 95% of renewable energy or low carbon energy in Sweden. So our average in Sweden is between 20 and 30 grams in terms of consumption of grams per kilowatt hours. So obviously you actually have a factor of 20x improvement if you would actually place your data center in the Nordics. It's fairly similar in Finland, Norway, and Iceland as well. So the Nordic countries are quite famous for that. Similar, you will see that in Canada, in Quebec, they have a lot of hydro, and in Ontario they have low carbon. So that is obviously something that we are quite proud of. I would say that we are low carbon, and we are sort of working towards that goal. But it doesn't mean that we are not importing goods from other countries where our consumption and our usage of natural resources are probably higher than the global average. So I think it's important to also distill what type of part of the conversation we have. For renewable energy, we're great. When it comes to consumption of material, we're not doing great, and we need to start working a lot more with regenerative and circular processes.
Talking of countries, in India, we have a very large population, and it's a population that is sort of getting wealthier, richer over the years. Growing up, I think our childhood was very sustainable because of the economic aspects of it, right? So you wouldn't waste any food, you wouldn't waste any fuel, you wouldn't waste anything. But that's changing, right? There's this big drive towards consumption and conspicuous consumption even. And, and part of what we have been trying to do at Nagarro is to talk about this not from the perspective of net zero, because that's fairly new for us, but more from the perspective of just building cities around public transport, for example, right? So a lot of effort, and not necessarily with great results yet, but a lot of effort in trying to make cities more, more conducive for public transport, for walking, for cycling, which also ends up being very energy efficient. And I was very inspired by my time in Stockholm, where I was there for a few months, and I probably took one cab, right? I didn't even need to take a car ever, right? Except for one particular time, just being very late from a party. But that's the kind of change that we have to bring, especially in a large country like India. If we start to, for example, just consume the way the West has, and I also lived many years in the US, and the US is, very very big on consumption. It's a completely consumer sort of economy. I think it's a disaster in the making, So I think just getting that right early on is very, very important.
Yes, absolutely. You said earlier that roughly we need to get down to 2 tons per person across the world, and I think just looking at Sweden, we're roughly around 8 to 12 tons per inhabitant. But then also, like you said, if we compare that to the US, you're somewhere between 22 to 26 ton per person. So we have a lot to do in the next 8 years, because we have collectively 59 gigaton of CO2 emissions in the world collectively. And that's the target that we need to halve in the next decade. So that's sort of what we need to steer towards to make sure that we end up in the safe zone, so to say, this 1.5 degree that's sort of is stipulated in the Paris Agreement, which we are still sort of trickling along, and we're not seeing that we are able to bend the curve as quickly as we should be. So we need to take some forceful action going forward.
Yeah, one of the most positive things I read recently was that some of the new futuristic cities that Saudi Arabia is building are meant to be, net zero, right? And I mean, just the fact that that effort is being made is very positive. But I guess you have this rich country versus poor country kind of negotiation at these events where poor countries have the perspective that the rich countries have already emitted so much carbon, and why should we hold ourselves to those high standards? Give us a chance to grow economically. But I think we really don't have time for these debates. I think we just have to cut back everywhere we can on the carbon dioxide that we are emitting.
Yes. But I think that, to your point there, Manas, I think that's it's extremely important to not to forget about the social aspects. I think it's extremely important to have fair working conditions, making sure that people are not overly worked. That if you're working in a factory, for example, that you're not exposed to hazardous substances, you're not putting hazardous substances into the products and so forth. So the social aspect is extremely important as well. And the social contract that a company or a government body has as well is equally important, because we can not only focus on the E in the ESG, we equally need to make sure that we can build a prosperous economy for everyone to live on this planet. So it is a tough balancing act, I would say. And I think in the end, the richer country is going to have to give and make sure that we can build sustainable infrastructure across the world, because what we saw in Pakistan this summer is just detrimental. I think when you have 1/3 of the country underwater, you have 30 million people displaced. It's really horrific to see, and this is going to change and affect us all. So
it's these events that you're seeing more and more, these weather events, that are really creating that kind of seriousness, I believe, about it. These have been forecast for a while,
yes,
but we all have been hoping that they don't happen, or imagining that they might not happen. But we're starting to see these, and all of us will agree that our winters aren't like the old winters. Our summers are not like the old summers. It's changing. It's dramatically changing.
yes.
So, just getting into some of the, what we need to do, you have this, I'll just pick these one after the other.
Mm.
So you talk about data centers and cloud providers, so maybe you can talk a bit about how a company should think about data centers and cloud providers in order to do right.
Yeah. I think, like I started this talk with saying that every company, every body or organization is going to have a different starting point. So I think it's important to assess where you are today. Do you have a lot of local servers? Do you have global data centers? Or are you a cloud-first shop, for example, working with one of the bigger hyperscalers, for example? So I think it's important to understand where you are today, how much assets do you have in these three type of categories, and then to assess in terms of how much carbon intensity do we have, where do we actually have these cloud servers or data centers, for example, and then to make that assessment in terms of, should we be relocating this, for example, or can we connect our global data center to green grid, for example? Can we start procuring renewable energy? Because that's also an alternative. I think also what we will see in the future is that we're going to have this edge computing going forward with local microgrids, maybe closely connected to a data center or a cloud, where you will use solar, you will use wind, and you will probably use battery storage. Microsoft has successfully tried, and others as well, have tried hydrogen for storage instead of using these large diesel generators for backup and so forth. So I think we will see a lot of new technologies coming into this space as well, and probably having a lot more localized access to renewable energy. Just because we have great access to renewable energy in Sweden today, it doesn't mean that we should move all of the data centers and cloud to Sweden or the Nordics. But we should think in systems thinking and see how can we work across industries? How can we work with the utility company, for example, to see how can we feed back the excess energy? How can we consume renewable energy or low carbon energy in a good way? In the book, I mentioned a very great example, and the Eco Data Center is not exclusive on this, but they're one of the few in the world where they work very closely with the utility provider, and they build the piping both for water and for excess heat, and they feed back the water and the excess heat back to the utility provider. And then the utility provider decides, should I push this to the district heating to heat homes or industries, or do I distribute it in a different way? So to create these more ecosystems that spans wider than just one industry, I think that's extremely important. Because in the past, I think that if you're a data center manager, you're just happy if you get electricity and the capacity into your data centers. But now you need to take this a step further. You need to work together with different providers to build these sustainable ecosystems.
Yeah, and you mentioned Microsoft there, and one of the very inspiring stories there is about their goal to be carbon negative by 2030.
Yes.
Which, given their huge footprint, is very, very impressive.
Yeah.
And it's about new technologies like hydrogen, like you mentioned, but also about new ways to align people. And I think the idea that really struck me was Microsoft's use of an internal carbon fee.
Yeah.
And so if you take a flight, you pay a fee internally to a function, which will just be doing R&D and development of new ideas for tackling carbon. It's an amazing idea.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think Microsoft has taken some very bold steps, because for years they've had an internal carbon price of $15 per ton of CO2 emissions. By July 1st of this year, they raised that to $100, which means, like you said, if you fly from Boston to London, that's roughly 1.5 ton per person. So that actually equates to $150 extra, which then goes into an innovation fund within Microsoft. But obviously, for a business area manager or someone owns the P&L lower down in the organization, it's going to affect their P&L. They're going to make more sustainable choices in terms of traveling and emission of carbon. And I think what we also will see is that this carbon price will be adjusted up. So if you don't do anything, and if you just live with the status quo and just accept that it's going to be $100, then we will also see staffing increase on this. And I've seen examples of some companies having an internal carbon price of $300. So I think that's also sort of the carrot and the stick to make sure that you increase it year on year, because that also incentivizes people to take action. You should connect it to executive compensation as well, because then it will really happen, so to say.
No, I think this is an idea that even we should probably pick up internally. I thought that was a very good idea. And I, again, would just recommend the book to everyone who's watching because it's this, it is a playbook. And, we're talking at a high level, but there's a lot more in terms of grids and tables and methods and stages and plans and that you can pick up and adopt. And it's very, very helpful for someone trying to address this topic. Um, Coming to, you talked about data centers, but you also talk about two other areas, well, many other areas, but two of
Yeah.
them being, the enterprise architecture and then the actual software development, right? So maybe you could just talk about that because I'm sure not many people know how that might impact, the carbon emissions from a company or organization.
Yes. So first of all, enterprise architecture is very close to my heart. That's a role that I had previously to stepping into this role as a CIO. And I think the great thing about enterprise architecture is that you work across the whole enterprise. You have sort of this bird's eye view of the whole estate. And for example, for a company that turns over 1 billion US, for example, on the average, according to a study by LeanIX, that you will have roughly 2,000 applications within your portfolio. And I could definitely say that it's a similar number to where I work. And if you have 2,000 applications, that means that you have underlying infrastructure to support this in terms of virtualized servers, you have hardware, you have network links, you have data transfer, integrations, and so forth. So we always talk about application rationalization in terms of harmonizing your applications, making delivering business value, to focus on the applications that deliver high business value and have low technical risk. But if you change that and say, okay, well, let's look at this at a perspective of how much carbon intensity that has this application. Should I be reassessing in terms of how I'm hosting it, how it's architected, where I'm hosting it? Can I rethink how we run the batches for this application, for example, to run it in low carbon mode? So that's quite important. So I think not only uncovering the great benefits of application portfolio management and rationalizing your applications, you can obviously save a lot of cost, which your CFO and your CEO is going to love. But you're also unlocking a lot of sustainability benefits by taking down the overall carbon intensity. The second part on software development, which I really, really like, because I think we need to empower people to be able to affect their everyday life. And I think like the scarcity that we have today with software engineers all over the world, I think it's also fantastic to be able to give them a tool where they can see in real time the code that they are developing in a cloud environment, for example. They can see how much energy it's consuming. They can see how much CO2 it's emitting based on where they're hosting this application or software. But also changing the behavior in terms of if you have a very complex DevOps tool chain, you have this large data sets or storage and so forth. The great thing about cloud is that it's consumption based. So you can also shut this down when you're not working with it. So shut down your environments, your test environments when you're going home for the day, for the weekend. And seen some great examples already where engineers are taking action and saying, well, I can actually be a great part of this by just turning down and shutting down the environments when I'm actually not working on it. Because I think the default is that you don't do it. You go home and then you fire up your computer and you start working the next day. So I think also to do more with less, it's also fantastic opportunity for software engineers. I think the Linux Foundation has just released a certification. It's a free certification. I'm sure we can put it in the link afterwards. where it goes through sort of the different steps of how you can develop sustainable software. And it takes you down through a number of different modules. And the certification is free. And you will also get a certification from the Linux Foundation. And it's been co-sponsored by the Green Software Foundation. So I saw that being released just the other day. So I think it's great when you see these things taking action, and we're bringing out tools for people to educate themselves on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a critical part, being able to have the awareness of how your actions are impacting this topic. At Nagarro, we are trying to extend it also beyond just the work we do, but also into people's personal lives. So one interesting thing we did was we are connecting voluntarily, allowing people to connect their energy readings with a central database and compare on a per person basis, based on the size of the family and location, etc., how they're doing on energy consumption versus other Nagarians, right? So we have a few thousand people have signed up for it. Not everyone has, but it gamifies it a little bit, right? And I think this awareness and this loop is very, very helpful. So just moving down the list, you also talk of the role of hardware management, and maybe a few words on that at a company level, at a personal level. I mean, how should one see this topic and its effect on global warming?
No, but I think, with 5.5 billion devices or computers out there today in circulation, I think I just heard that the other day we passed 8 billion people across the world. So it's almost one computer per person now across the world. But I think when you speak to people, they don't necessarily realize that this device that they are being handed in their hand has already consumed 80% of the carbon budget before they actually release it. So a simple laptop, or not a simple laptop, but a standard laptop, emits roughly 320 kilograms over a 4-year life cycle. And 80% of that is already consumed before you receive it in your hand. And you will see the similar number for a smartphone, for example, where a smartphone from Apple, for example, is releasing 70 kilos over a 3-year life cycle, where the usage phase is only 12 to 14%. It might not sound so much on an individual level, but I think it's important to think about the awareness and the circularity around this, because we also have this tendency to go out and buy the latest technology. We also want to be at the edge of new technology development, so to say. But I also think it's important to focus on keeping the longevity of the assets, like your phone, for example, to make sure that you keep it alive as long as possible, and that we infuse policies like right to repair, for example, where if your battery is starting to default or having low performance, there should be a way to replace it quite simply, I would say, because that shouldn't be a single failure for that device, for example. Similarly to a laptop, for example, that's been around for 3-4 years, having an upgrade on the memory, having an upgrade on the SD RAM is probably good enough, for example, and replace the battery, and you can probably keep it alive for a couple of more years. It doesn't work for everyone. It probably doesn't work for engineers that is running, very, very complex data sets and so forth. But then I think it's important to find sort of the next home when that device, after 3 years maybe, is becoming end of use. What can you do with that device to pass it forward in the chain, and make sure that it's managed in a sustainable way? One scary fact about IT hardware management is that collectively in the world, on a personal level, we are recycling roughly 20% of our electronic devices today. But if you look at corporations, it's actually only 10% that is properly documented and properly disposed and recycled. So I think that's an enormous figure for improvements, because what we see obviously with rising energy prices, rising material prices, cost of metals, rare metals, and so forth, I also see that this will become a new revenue stream where vendors will start using a lot more non-virgin material in their devices, because otherwise it's going to be way too expensive to manufacture them going forward, unless we actually recycle a lot of the material. Today, we can recycle roughly 98.5% of a laptop. So we only have 1.5% left to go. And that 1.5%, that is actually mercury. Because mercury is fluent in room temperature, so it's still much cheaper to break new mercury than recycling the existing one. So the technology is already here to manage the hardware, but we need to think in different types of ecosystems, working with different partners that can provide you better data sets, better data points, better transparency, traceability along the way to have a full sort of blockchain of your whole supply chain of your IT assets. Just to leave you one last figure on that, just looking at a company of 30,000 devices over a 10-year period, and I have this example in the book as well, is that if you have a 3-year life cycle of the devices, you replace roughly 10,000 of the devices every 3 years, and then the company is doing well, so they are growing by 10%. This actually will generate roughly 50,000 tons of CO2 emission, in indirect emission, per year. So this is any company around the world of this size. So the emissions are not insignificant from our IT hardware. So maybe on an individual level, it doesn't seem that much. But when we started adding this up into a corporate level, then this figure becomes enormous. And then you just start multiplying it across industries. And it's mind-boggling how big it is.
Yeah, that's an area to focus on. How can we reduce, reuse, recycle, as the saying goes? And again, in the past, it was driven also by economic considerations in countries like India, where you would just try to squeeze the last bit of life out of every device. And as things get a little bit, people get a little bit richer, companies get a little bit more well off, that goes away. And I think in some ways we have to go back to the older ways of thinking, because we may be able to afford these devices in terms of money, but we can't afford them in terms of climate impact. And it's a new idea of affordability that I think we all have to internalize as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that we don't talk enough about, and it's VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, or PC as a service, as some of the hyperscalers have coined it. Because I think that's something that we could probably rethink in terms of, and I've seen some great studies where I mentioned the 320 kilos on a physical laptop in terms of CO2 emission. If you use a virtual desktop over a 4-year lifespan, then that CO2 emission on the server side will be roughly 80 kilos, for example. So a dramatic decrease in CO2 emissions. And obviously, Nagarro is a partner of ASSA ABLOY. I'm sure you give your employees laptops. So we should, instead of giving you additional hardware, we should actually give you a virtual client to log in and to save on carbon footprint. So I also think that there's a lot of duplication that we can also remove by just rethinking the approach of it. And from a security perspective, I know that the chief information security officer, they really like the VDI, because then you have a closed, patched, compartmentalized client that you can keep up to date. It's always accessible. So, and then you keep the the power or the server power on the server side instead of the client side, which also results in that you need less high performance computers on client side as opposed to server side.
Yeah, it's totally doable. I think, at least for many applications, many contexts, it's totally doable. And sometimes we do some things like that for security reasons when working with banks, for example. So I think it's something we definitely can look into. Moving to the last topic before we start taking questions, is the topic of sustainability by IT, which is tech being used to actually create more sustainable solutions. And one example that I liked was about usership over ownership, and I'm just happy to say that we do with BMW, for example, BMW motorcycles.
Mm-hmm.
You can rent or subscribe to a motorcycle as you need it. And that's done by us, actually, by Nagarro. And, these kinds of solutions are getting more and more popular in the automotive space. We're working on others that we can't talk about. But it's a really, I think it's a mindset change. And the young people, they are completely aligned with it. It's not so anyway, I'm just sort of drifting into this, but maybe you could say a few words on sustainability by IT, and is it really something that would be significant, or is it likely to be more of greenwashing or
No, but I think it's extremely important to work on your footprint. Sustainability in IT, but sustainability by IT is obviously your handprint and what you put in your products, what you put into your solutions, and the effect that it has on both the downstream and the upstream when you are producing or consuming these devices. So I think that there are fantastic examples in terms of route planning, for example, to optimize the supply chain for delivery trucks, for example. That also obviously requires that we electrify buses and trains and large scale trucks and so forth. But this is really the biggest opportunity, I think, to leverage IT to create sustainable solutions going forward. But doing so, it's extremely important to make sure that you build it on sustainable digital infrastructure that is sustainable by design. Because I think there are great technology in the pipeline to be able to solve our challenges around climate change. But if we don't think about the implications of sustainable IT, I think that's it's going to be a challenge for us. But the greatest opportunity is obviously, as a technology leader, as myself, to work with the business and find how can we leverage IT to deliver sustainable solutions going forward. I think that's really the biggest opportunity out there.
Great. So now we'll open this up to questions. I can see a few questions that have come in. So the first question that I'll take is around home offices.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us are working from home offices. I'm in a home office right now. What can be a first step for sustainability for workers in home offices?
Well, I think first of all, if we have a hybrid approach in terms of not going into the office every day, there's obviously the savings on the commute that you have. But then the second thing is also to make sure that you, if the possibility is there, to run your home office on renewable energy, for example. And since you are working in a home office, maybe there's an opportunity for your employer to actually incentivize that, for example. We also see, when we look at sort of the energy trends across the company in terms of how many people are turning off their devices or the computers at night, we see that roughly 30 to 40% across the globe is actually leaving their laptops, their computers and screens on for the night. And most people, obviously, they don't work more than 8 to 10 hours a day. So there's a lot of overutilized energy that actually could just simply be taken away. But then I think to understand the energy patterns as well. Myself, we have automatic switches in all of the rooms that we have. We can monitor in real time how much energy we are consuming, and also to automatically turn off devices at a certain time, for example, when the carbon intensity is higher or the energy prices is higher, for example. So we tend to run a lot of the electronic devices like the dishwasher and the washing machine and the dryer. We actually set them to start at 1 o'clock at night, because that's when the energy intensity is lower. That's a bit outside the home office realm, but still it's something to think about in terms of how we can improve sort of even out the peaks and troughs with energy consumption.
Right. We find that in India, for example, in winter times, it definitely is a plus to have people not commuting. We are a little bit more confused about summertime, because we have air conditioning running in every home, and so I think that thinking holistically is going to be important to try to figure out, what makes more sense when, right? So, but it's an interesting question, because more and more the way to tap into top talent is to sort of follow them wherever they are.
Yes.
And give them the flexibility to operate the way they do. And we had done this research earlier that the average person was spending around 100 minutes in commute, and a lot of them were using cars or personal vehicles and not much public transport. So there is a huge advantage, but this air conditioning thing is something that we have to sort out. I just find it somehow frustrating that in order to cool a human body, you have to cool a room or a hall or something. It just sounds. In fact, there is this little center for clean energy at Plaksha University, which we support as a company. We're just trying to figure out how to do like this sort of micro cooling and follow people around the room. But let's see how that goes.
Yes, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, you have the opposite problem with heating, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Colder climates, right?
Yes.
The next one is the principles of degrowth, decouple economic growth from environment impact. I don't know. It seems to have some solutions to achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. Do you see degrowth playing a role in the IT industry as well?
Well, I think we talked about the circularity, right? I think we need to rethink sort of our approach from a product economy to more of a subscription economy. Because I think when we talk about sustainability, we're obviously talking about people, we're talking about planet, but we're also talking about profit. I think it's extremely important that all of these three are aligned and they are weighing in a consistent way, because it's also important for social prosperity, for democratization, for economic wealth, that we're also raising the level of standards across the world. So I think to rethink how we can transition from a product to a circular economy, it's probably the way I would suggest to go, looking at different types of approaches. And we mentioned the example around data center to recycle energy. For example, around hardware, there's great opportunity to recycle the material, start using non-virgin material in the manufacturing process. There are already examples like Fairphone, a Dutch company producing a phone which has half impact as opposed to a iPhone, for example. And that is primarily due to that they are using a lot of non-virgin material in the manufacturing. But then they also give you a 5-year warranty on the product, because it's completely modular. You can replace the battery, you can replace the camera, you can replace the screen, you can replace the back screen. So I think also to force the industry to become more modular in that sense. And that, yes, that will probably bring down the revenue of those companies selling these devices, because then they won't sell the latest device as often, because we will prolong the longevity. But I also think there's a great opportunity to transition into other revenue streams. I think Apple today, they have roughly 40% of their revenue today is recurring revenue from iCloud and for different types of services that they are producing. So they are also, making that shift while they're still being a hardware provider, selling smartphones, computers, and so forth.
Great. Now, here's a question that I don't know whether you can answer clearly or not. It's does your book, I'll just read it out as the way it's written, right? Does your book have any influence on how ASSA ABLOY is going into the future? And what else is ASSA ABLOY doing in terms of sustainability? Any best practices that you can share with us?
Yes. Well, I guess there's two parts to that question. I think that the first one is obviously yes. We are practicing what we're preaching, obviously. So what you will find in the book is based on a lot of know-how that we have applied, that we are working towards, the requirements that we are putting on Nagarro or our partners, our cloud vendors as well. So we are already starting to have these tough conversations. But then I think the most interesting part, and being working for a purposeful company like ASSA ABLOY, is that we have committed to science-based targets. We did that already in October of 2020. So under the leadership of Charles Robbins, our head of sustainability, for the last 2 years, we have sort of calculated our baseline for our CO2 emissions. We also have a new legislation coming into effect as of January 2024, where the EU taxonomy, which means that it's not only that we need to report on our scope 1 and scope 2, we also need to report on our scope 3. And what ASSA ABLOY is committed to is that we are going to halve our CO2 footprint from our 2019 baseline to 2030. And we are going to be net zero no later than 2050. So there are a lot of activities ongoing to manage that. I think we are making good progress on electricity, on waste management, on how we're using water. I think the biggest challenge for us is going to be how can we find new sources to procure low carbon steel, for example. So that's something that we need together with the industry to figure out. There are players out there. You have H2 Green Steel in northern Sweden building a huge factory. You have hybrid. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we need to sort out in terms of meeting the demand and supply for steel going forward. Secondly, is to really have that quality mark on our products in terms of how much CO2 is each product that we are producing, releasing, so to say. So, and that's something called LCA, life cycle assessment. So that's something also that will come into law in the EU in 2024, that we need to have a carbon sticker on it in terms of how much has the CO2 been emitted from this product. And then I would actually expect that by 2026, we will have a carbon tax on the products as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that will drive the industry forward as well to become a lot more sustainable.
Great to hear. Great to hear. We have time for one last question and then maybe some closing remarks. This question is that the person says a new type of testing should be done on the application that validates the sustainability of the application deployment. I mean, does this exist already? Is there a way to do that, and are companies doing this already?
I haven't heard anything that there are, automatic testing in any way, testing the different criteria for sustainability. I think it's what I've seen so far is more on monitoring the real time, or when you're actually developing the application itself. I'm sure that we will see these types of frameworks emerging, similarly to when we talked about security by design 15 years ago, and there was a lot of frameworks emerging around that. I think similarly to this, we will also see sustainability by design in software development emerging, but so far haven't seen anything that sort of can automatically check your code or any way that. There are great checkboxes or checklists out there. I would really recommend you to check out the certification. I'm sure we can put that in the show notes, because that also gives you a very good understanding of the different areas that you can lever as a software engineer when you develop your code.
Great. So this is all we have time for. Maybe some final words from you, Niklas, and then a couple of words, a little thank you from my side, because it's been great to have you here. But if you had to leave us with one final thought, what would that be?
Yeah. No, like we started this talk, I think what I set out to do in this book, my mission was to create a vehicle for change, really. That I wanted to educate, I wanted to inspire, and I wanted to activate people. And I think what you will see browsing through the book, reading the examples, listening to some of the thought leaders in the book, you will also realize that you can take action tomorrow. And I think that's the most powerful message that I can send. That this is not something that's 5 years down the line. This is very practical. I would love to hear all of these success stories, because then I know that we are making great progress together to build sustainable digital infrastructure. So get yourself educated, get yourself inspired, and activate yourself. That's sort of my 3 key focus.
I would encourage everyone to go and buy the book. It really is very, very valuable. And I'd just like to thank Niklas for just being here and sharing time with us, but also for writing the book, because it must have been a lot of effort. And I will end with one quote from the book. It's actually Greta Thunberg's sentence that the book also repeats. Act as though your house is on fire, because it is, right? And I think these are very simple words, but we are at a time where we have to take every action that we can to try to avert this crisis. The house is on fire, and this book gives us a good way to figure out what we can do right here, right now, to make a change. So thank you so much, Niklas. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much, Manas. Great to be here.